snow was already climbing past her ankles when Lynn realized something terrible. She was going to die out here. The wind howled across the frozen plains like a living thing. Sharp, relentless, hungry. Each breath cut her lungs like broken glass. And the world around her was nothing but white. No road, no houses, no voices. Only endless snow swallowing every sound she tried to make. Lynn had crossed an ocean chasing a promise. America, they had said, was a land where even the poorest girl could build a new life. But somewhere between the railroad station and the wagons heading west, everything had fallen apart. Men shouting in a language she barely understood, horses rearing, wagons leaving in a cloud of dust and panic. And when the chaos ended, she was alone. Now the sun was sinking behind the mountains, bleeding red through the storm clouds, and the cold was no longer outside her body. It had moved inside her bones. Her silk dress, meant for warm southern evenings, clung to her skin like ice. Her slippers were soaked through. She could no longer feel her toes. Each step forward felt heavier than the last, until finally she stumbled, hard. The snow swallowed her hands as she tried to push herself up again, but her arms trembled too badly to lift her weight. The cold whispered something soft and dangerous into her mind. Just lie down. Just close your eyes. Then she heard it, a sound, faint, rhythmic, wood creaking slowly, iron wheels grinding over frozen earth, the steady thud of hooves, a wagon. Hope hit her chest like fire. She forced her frozen legs to move, stumbling through waist-deep snow toward the sound. The wagon rolled along a narrow trail between skeletal pine trees, its driver facing forward, unaware. If she called out, the wind would steal her voice. If she fell again, she would never stand. So Lynn did the only thing desperation allowed. She ran. Or at least she tried to. Her body lurched forward through the snow until she reached the back of the wagon. Her fingers grabbed the wooden tailgate, and with the last strength left in her body, she pulled herself inside. Sacks of flour, wood crates, a heavy canvas tarp. She crawled beneath it, curling into the smallest shape she could make. The smell of grain and cold iron filled her lungs. Her teeth rattled violently. But for the first time since the storm began, the wind could no longer reach her. And somewhere between terror and exhaustion, Lynn fell asleep, hidden in the back of a stranger's wagon on a road that led deep into the winter mountains. The man driving that wagon had no idea his quiet life had just changed forever. Because the moment he discovered the small frozen girl hiding beneath his cargo, he would whisper something he had never said about anything in his life. Best wrong turn I ever made. The wagon kept moving through the darkening forest trail. The horses knew the road well. Their hooves pressed steady rhythms into the snow as the sky slowly turned from iron gray to deep winter blue. Thomas Hale barely noticed the cold. Men like him stopped feeling winter years ago. His ranch sat nearly 20 miles from the nearest town, hidden deep in the foothills where the mountains swallowed the horizon. Most people avoided land that remote. Thomas preferred it that way. Silence was easier than people. The town of Redemption tolerated him, but never truly welcomed him. They called him many things: quiet man, mountain ghost. Some even whispered worse. But Thomas never argued. He simply bought his supplies, loaded his wagon, and returned to the life he had built far away from their voices. Tonight was no different. The wagon creaked under sacks of flour, lamp oil, and winter salt. The trail wound slowly through the frozen trees. The world was calm, predictable, familiar. Until a sound. Soft, barely there, like a broken breath hidden inside the cargo. Thomas pulled the reins. The horses slowed, then stopped. The sudden silence felt enormous. Even the wind seemed to pause. He listened. Years alone in the mountains had sharpened his senses. He knew the difference between animals, branches, snow, and something human. There it was again, a weak, shivering gasp, coming from the back of the wagon. Thomas stood slowly. His boots dropped into the snow with a dull crunch as he stepped down from the driver's seat. The lantern hanging beside him swayed gently in the wind. Most men in these mountains would have drawn a gun. A stowaway could mean trouble, a thief, a drifter, someone desperate enough to turn dangerous. Thomas reached the back of the wagon. His large hand gripped the edge of the canvas tarp. For a moment, he hesitated. Then he pulled it back. The lantern light spilled into the cargo bed and revealed a small, trembling shape curled between the sacks. A girl, not older than 20. Her dark hair spilled across the canvas like ink, her skin pale against the cold. Her silk dress was torn, soaked through, completely wrong for a winter this brutal. Her eyes snapped open the moment the lantern light touched her face. Wide, terrified. She looked at him as if you might throw her back into the snow. For several seconds, neither of them moved. The cold air filled the space between them. Thomas studied her quietly. She was shaking so violently her teeth rattled. Not pretending, not hiding, just freezing. He had seen this before. Travelers lost in storms, bodies found frozen in the spring thaw, people who ran out of time. But this girl, she didn't belong in this world at all. Her face was delicate, unfamiliar, foreign. A porcelain figure dropped into a land made of iron and ice. She tried to sit up, but her strength failed. A weak sound escaped her lips. Not a word, just a desperate breath. Thomas said nothing. Words had never been his strongest tool. Instead, he reached beside the wagon seat and pulled out the thick wool horse blanket he carried for emergencies. He shook the snow from it, then gently laid it over her shoulders, careful not to touch her skin. The warmth hit her immediately. Lynn clutched the blanket like a lifeline. Her eyes followed him in disbelief. She had expected anger, shouting, to be dragged from the wagon. Instead, this silent stranger had simply covered her with warmth. Thomas stepped back, then climbed into the driver's seat again. He gathered the reins. The horses shifted. Before the wagon started moving, he spoke one rough word, the first she had heard from him. "Stay." The wagon rolled forward once more, carrying them deeper into the mountains, toward a lonely cabin where two strangers who shared no language would slowly begin to understand each other. The cabin appeared almost suddenly, a dark wooden shape rising from the snow as the trail curved around the base of the foothills. Smoke drifted from the stone chimney, a thin gray ribbon against the deep blue winter sky. Thomas brought the wagon to a stop beside the porch. For a moment he said nothing. Then he stepped down, unhitched the horses, and led them toward the barn. Lynn stayed where she was, still wrapped in the thick wool blanket, still unsure if this strange kindness might disappear. When he returned, a lantern swung in his hand. Its warm light cut through the frozen dark. He looked at her for a moment, not studying her like a curiosity, just making sure she could still stand. Then he nodded toward the cabin door. An invitation, nothing more. Her feet screamed with pain when she climbed down from the wagon. The blood returning to frozen skin burned like fire. But the light spilling from the open doorway pulled her forward. Inside, warmth wrapped around her like a second blanket. The cabin was simple. One room, a stone fireplace burning low, a wooden table, two chairs, a narrow bed against the far wall, shelves of books, tools, jars of dried herbs. It was not a place made for comfort, but it was safe. Thomas pointed toward the chair beside the fire. "Sit." The word sounded rough, like it had not been used much. She obeyed immediately. The heat from the fire slowly reached her hands, her face, her frozen feet. Her body trembled uncontrollably as warmth returned. Thomas moved quietly around the room, adding wood to the fire, setting a kettle over the flames. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost careful, as if sudden noise might scare her away. Soon the small cabin filled with the smell of oatmeal and coffee. He placed a bowl on the table, then another. He did not ask her questions, did not demand explanations. He simply nodded once toward the food. "Eat." Lynn hesitated, then slowly moved to the table. Her hands trembled as she lifted the spoon. The warmth spread through her chest, chasing away the cold that had lived inside her bones all day. Across the table, Thomas watched quietly, not staring, just observing, making sure she was real. For the first time since leaving her homeland, Lynn felt something unfamiliar. Not safety, not yet, but the possibility of it. The days that followed passed in quiet rhythms. Thomas rose before sunrise. He chopped wood, checked the horses, repaired fences buried in snow. When he returned, food waited on the table. Simple meals, bread, oatmeal, stew. Lynn spoke very little, mostly because she could not. His language was still a wall she could barely climb, but she found ways to help. She washed the dishes, swept the floor, mended the small tear in her silk dress. One afternoon, while Thomas worked in the barn, she noticed one of his shirts hanging near the bed. The collar was badly frayed. She took a needle and thread from a small wooden box on the shelf. Carefully, patiently, she repaired it. Her stitches were small, precise, almost invisible. When Thomas returned later that evening, he noticed immediately. The shirt folded neatly on the bed, repaired. He said nothing, just studied the careful stitching. Then the next morning, he wore it. The silence between them slowly changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It became something softer, a quiet understanding built from small observations. Thomas noticed the way Lynn listened to birds outside the window, the way she paused to watch snow fall, the calm grace in her hands when she worked. Lynn noticed other things, the way he spoke gently to his horses, the careful patience in his movements, the strength in his shoulders when he lifted heavy logs beside the cabin. Sometimes, when he returned from the cold, snow clung to his coat, melting slowly in the warmth of the fire. Lynn would look up from her sewing, just for a second longer than necessary. And Thomas would notice. He always noticed. One evening, as the fire burned low and the wind moved quietly through the trees, their eyes met across the small table. Neither spoke, needed to. Because something had already begun to change inside that quiet cabin. Something fragile, something dangerous, something neither of them expected when she climbed into the back of his wagon. Trust. A week after Lynn arrived, Thomas prepared the wagon again. Snow still covered the valley, but the sky was clear enough for a short trip. He pulled on his heavy coat, tightened the leather strap on the horses, then looked toward the cabin door. Town. The word was simple, explanation enough. His eyes shifted toward Lynn. Lock the door. It was the longest sentence he had spoken to her yet. Not an order, a warning. She nodded slowly and watched as the wagon disappeared between the frozen trees. For the first time since she climbed into that wagon, she was alone again. The cabin felt larger without him, the wind louder, the mountains further away. But she followed the small routine she had learned, sweeping the floor, warming soup over the fire, folding the blankets near the bed. Hours passed. The afternoon sun slowly slipped behind the foothills, and just as the first shadows stretched across the snow, she heard it. Horses, more than one. Her body froze. The sound of hooves grew louder outside the cabin. Then voices, men's voices. Lynn moved slowly toward the small window. Her breath fogged the glass as she looked outside. 4 riders stood in the yard, their coats dark against the snow, their eyes fixed on the cabin. She understood immediately. They were not here by accident. One of them dismounted, a tall man with a sour face and narrow eyes. Finch. He stepped onto the porch and knocked once, hard. "Open up!" Lynn stepped back from the door, her heart hammered in her chest. She understood very few English words, but tone needed no translation. Outside, the men muttered among themselves. "She's in there. Town says he brought her from somewhere east. Could be trouble." Finch knocked again, harder. "Girl!" Silence answered him. Inside the cabin, Lynn stood perfectly still, her hand resting on the wooden table, waiting. The men outside grew impatient. Finch turned toward the others. "Thomas thinks he can hide things from us." One of the younger riders shifted nervously in his saddle. "We just want to see her." Then another voice cut through the cold air, deep, steady, dangerously calm. "That won't happen." Every head turned. Thomas rode into the yard. Snow kicked up behind his horse as he pulled the reins. His eyes moved slowly across the men, counting, measuring. 4 against 1. He dismounted without hurry. The quiet weight of his presence settled over the yard. Finch sneered. "Well, look who's back." He jerked his chin toward the cabin. "Town's asking questions." Thomas stepped forward, one slow step at a time, until he stood directly between them and the cabin door. "She's my guest." His voice was low, but absolute. Finch spat into the snow. "You expect us to believe that?" Miller, the older rancher beside him, studied Thomas carefully. "People say she's hiding from something." Thomas didn't move, didn't blink, didn't step aside. "This is my land." Each word landed like a hammer. "She stays." The air tightened. Hands hovered closer to gun belts. Snow drifted silently around them. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Miller exhaled slowly. "Storm's coming." He glanced toward the mountains. Dark clouds rolled across the horizon, a wall of winter. He looked back at Thomas. "This isn't finished." The men turned their horses, riding away across the frozen valley, leaving only silence behind. Thomas stood in the yard a moment longer, watching them disappear. Then he turned toward the cabin. Inside, Lynn stood near the door, her hand still trembling. When he stepped inside, their eyes met. She didn't need to understand the words spoken outside. Only one thing mattered. He had stood between her and the world. Outside, a snowflake fell from the darkening sky. The storm was coming, and this time it would trap them together. The storm did not arrive gently. It arrived like a living thing. By nightfall, the wind screamed across the mountains, slamming against the cabin walls like a furious beast. Snow swallowed the world outside. The trail vanished. The valley disappeared. There was no sky, no earth, only white chaos. Inside the cabin, the fire roared. Thomas moved calmly through the room, checking the window sills, packing cloth into small cracks where icy wind tried to force its way inside. Every movement was practiced. A man who had survived many winters. Lynn watched him quietly from the chair beside the fire. In his silence, there was no fear, only knowledge. But on the second night, something changed. A violent crash exploded through the storm from the direction of the barn, followed by the terrified scream of a horse. Thomas was already moving. He grabbed his lantern and the thick rope by the door. "Stay!" The word cut through the roaring wind. Then he stepped outside. The storm swallowed him instantly. His lantern became a small, trembling light, then vanished. Minutes stretched like hours. The wind rattled the cabin walls. Snow scraped against the windows. Lynn paced the small room, her heart pounding. She had known this man for barely days, yet the thought of losing him in that white darkness sent fear through her chest like ice. Finally, the door burst open. Thomas stumbled inside, half buried in snow, his beard frozen with ice. "The barn roof collapsed," he said between breaths. "One of the horses is cut bad." He gathered cloth, water, his small tin of salve, but when Lynn saw the wound, she shook her head. It was deep, too deep for simple medicine. Her eyes moved across the shelves, searching, thinking. Then she found it, a bag of coarse salt. She poured some into hot water, crushed a handful of pine needles in her hands, releasing their sharp scent, and mixed them together. Thomas watched her, confused. She looked up, met his eyes, and spoke slowly. "Trust." It was one of the few English words she knew, but it was enough. He nodded. Together they worked in the barn, the storm raging around them. Thomas held the trembling horse steady, while Lynn carefully cleaned the wound with the steaming mixture. Her hands were steady, precise, the kind of quiet skill learned from watching elders heal with whatever the land offered. The horse survived the night, then the next, and the next. 3 days later, the storm finally died. The world outside had changed. Snow stood taller than fences. The valley glittered under a pale winter sun. Thomas stepped outside, scanning the distant hills. Then he saw it. Movement. A riderless horse pawing desperately through the drifts. He saddled his own horse immediately, riding through deep snow toward the ridge. There he found Miller, half buried in the cold, his leg broken from a fall, his breath barely visible in the frozen air. Thomas lifted the man onto his saddle and carried him back, slowly, carefully, through the drifts. When they reached the cabin, Lynn was waiting, the door open, steam rising from a pot beside the fire. Together they saved the man who had once come to drive her away. When Finch and the others finally arrived searching for Miller, they found something unexpected. Not danger, not secrets, but a quiet cabin, a wounded rancher recovering beside the fire, and the foreign girl calmly tending the broth. Miller spoke first, his voice rough but certain. "They saved my life." No one argued after that. The suspicion faded, replaced by something closer to respect. When the men left, they placed gifts on the porch. Apples, cured meat, a roll of warm wool cloth. peace offerings. Spring slowly began to creep into the mountains. Snow melted into clear streams. Grass pushed through the frozen earth. And life inside the cabin changed too. Silence no longer meant distance. It meant comfort. One evening, Lynn sat beside the fire, mending one of Thomas's shirts. Her needle moved slowly through the fabric, the same careful stitches she had made on her first night there. Thomas watched her from across the room, then finally spoke. For the first time, he said her name. "Lynn?" She looked up, a soft smile touching her lips. He reached across the table, gently covering her hand with his. "I'm Thomas. I'm Thomas." Outside, snow melted from the roof. Water dripped steadily onto the earth below. Winter was ending, but something new had already begun. Thomas glanced toward the mountains, then back at the woman who had once hidden in the back of his wagon. A quiet smile touched his lips. He leaned closer and whispered softly, "Best wrong turn I ever made."